Good evening. I'm Faye Jensen, the CEO of the South Carolina Historical Society. Welcome to the last of our 2023 Winter Lecture Series. As always, I need to remind those of you in attendance that you'll be muted throughout the webinar, so please type your questions in the chat box and I'll try to get to them after the talk. I am delighted to welcome our speaker, Dr. David Dangerfield, who joins us tonight from USC-Salkehatchie. He has been a member of the faculty there since 2015. A native of South Carolina, Dr. Dangerfield graduated from Erskine College and received his master's degree from the Citadel CFC graduate program and his PhD from the University of South Carolina. His research interests include free persons of color and non-elite whites in the antebellum South and South Carolina. Dr. Dangerfield has written a number of articles which have been published by the Washington Post, the South Carolina Historical Association, and the Journal of Agricultural History. Please welcome Dr. David Dangerfield.
Thank you. I'm going to switch screens. Okay, there we are. Sorry about that. I want to start this talk by thanking the South Carolina Historical Society and Dr. Jensen and their staff for the invitation. And I want to thank all of you for logging in tonight or for watching it at whatever point you're watching it. This lecture draws from my ongoing project on free people of color in antebellum South Carolina, and also some work from colleagues who also study this subject area. So let me start this talk by introducing you to William Davis. I shared a story online back in February of 2022, and so you may have seen it making rounds on social media in the Charleston area last year. The image that you see is from the 1850 federal census, the population census. In 1850, William Davis was 90 years old, that's him on the bottom line, and he reported his occupation to the census taker as drummer to General Marion. I'm sure that he was proud of his service to his country so many years before, but Davis also knew that as a Black man in 1850, his freedom and legal status were delicate. And I'll talk more about that before I close this talk. Davis also knew that having served his country in the military, it afforded him a little greater degree of security and standing, even in 1850. I ran across William Davis early in my graduate studies while researching free people of color in antebellum South Carolina. I've been studying their remarkable community for over a decade, so they're going to appear prominently tonight while I talk about the African-American experience in and shortly after the American Revolution. This period of our history brought change in many ways, and it brought a brief moment of hope for African Americans. Some became free through British policy or patriotic goodwill. And for those like William Davis, the revolution offered avenues, and I should stress limited avenues, for some change in their circumstances during the years to come. But for most free people of color, that hope was lost or deferred soon after the revolution was over. My talk tonight focuses on the ways that African Americans experienced the American Revolution, first focusing on their interactions with the British, then their interactions with the Patriots, and I will close with some thoughts on how freedom was deferred, or specifically the ways that circumstances changed rapidly for enslaved and for free people of color soon after the revolution concluded. So starting with British policy. British policy probably started in Virginia rather than in South Carolina. Virginia's royal governor, John Murray, also known as Lord Dunmore, issued what is known as Dunmore's Proclamation in November of 1775. It promised freedom to any person enslaved by a patriot if they ran away and joined with the British war effort. It was intended to draw enslaved men to create a fifth column of enslaved insurrectionists, and was also designed to tie up and deprive patriots of their resources. Some estimate that British policy led to as many as 100,000 enslaved people escaping from their masters during the war. Indeed, Dunmore's proclamation immediately juxtaposed the Patriots' rhetoric about freedom and equality against their continued slave ownership. Moreover, it further soured the relationship between the British and colonists at a time when peace was, at least in theory, still on the table. In Charleston, the last royal governor, Lord William Campbell, gave shelter to scores of enslaved people, maybe as many as 500, who made their way to Sullivan's Island in the fall of 1775. On the narrow island, they were afforded some small degree of protection by British warships in the harbor. But their bold defiance so angered the colonists that the Council of Safety authorized a party of Patriot Rangers to raid their camp in December of 1775, re-enslaving those who would be taken prisoner and killing those who would not. About 20 managed to swim to safety with British warships, and more would follow in the days shortly thereafter. Both of these happenings in 1775 are present in the grievances listed in the Declaration of Independence, specifically in the very last clause in those list of grievances. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us. Now, eager to use African Americans against rebellious colonists, the British military allowed enslaved people to seek escape behind their lines. And while the policy was aimed at recruiting Black men for service or labor, we estimate that perhaps half of all slave defections to the British were women and children. And it's probably impossible to know how many of them truly ran away from Patriot enslavers, or how many may have actually run away from loyalists. Serving the British took many forms. Some of the Black Charlestonians who'd escaped slavery by swimming to Lord Campbell's ships just before he fled Charleston Harbor would actually return with Campbell and with Peter Parker's fleet in June of 1776 during their bid to retake Charleston, which of course met its doom in the Battle of Fort Sullivan. Perhaps the most consequential African-American service to the British in South Carolina came as late as 1781, when the British formed what would later become known as the Carolina Corps, a troop of Black dragoons or mounted cavalry soldiers. These soldiers fought in the Lowcountry after Yorktown until they were evacuated to serve the British Empire in the Caribbean. And then there's the story of James Armistead Lafayette, pictured here. He may have my favorite story from all of those that I'll share tonight. My colleague at the University of South Carolina, Woody Holton, describes Lafayette's experience in his recent book titled Liberty is Sweet. James Lafayette was born enslaved in Virginia sometime around 1750. And in 1781, he began what appeared to be service for the British military. First as a servant and guide for Benedict Arnold, and then later for none other than Lord Cornwallis himself. But things were not as they seemed. In reality, James was serving the Marquis de Lafayette, who had commissioned him to spy on the British. Shortly after his surrender at Yorktown, Cornwallis was stunned to find James within the American camp. I imagine that General Cornwallis's jaw probably dropped as he marveled at the deception. Professor Holton relates that Cornwallis greeted Lafayette simply by repeatedly calling him a rogue. In 1786, James acquired his freedom and would later qualify for a pension, helped by a letter of testimony written by the Marquis de Lafayette himself, who James honored by choosing the surname Lafayette. As good as this story is, it's surely the exception rather than the rule. Many of the formerly enslaved people who moved with Cornwallis's army were left behind at Yorktown after the surrender. Afflicted with smallpox, as many as a third of them died. Even after Yorktown, British forces in South Carolina continued fighting, which meant that enslaved people were still an active part of British strategy. At that time, there were more than 700 who were serving the British in the city of Charleston, and still others in Savannah. With hostilities ongoing in the southern colonies and the British cause in doubt, the British actually stepped up their tactical efforts to liberate people enslaved by patriots, a factor that contributed to John Laurens' death when he led efforts to oppose British raids in the Lowcountry. Patriots tried to convince the British to allow American slave owners to recover enslaved people who had defected to the British in exchange for returning seized Loyalist property. Instead, the British held court hearings, and they allowed these folks to keep their freedom if they would but merely testify that they had run away and joined the British. Running away to the British was indeed a gamble, and it cannot be overstated that the reward was very uncertain. Most of those who were able to evacuate with the British military were taken to Nova Scotia, out of the reach of slave owners. They stayed there in a state of limbo for years as British authorities debated their fate, ultimately sending many of them to a place that they'd never been before, to West Africa and Freetown in Sierra Leone. As many as 10,000 who were still held by Loyalists were spirited out. Some ended up in West Florida, and for others, a crueler fate awaited them in the West Indies. Shifting our attention to African Americans and the patriot side of the war, and as we look at how African Americans related to the patriot cause, we should first consider just how deeply that grievance in the Declaration of Independence was felt. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us. Widespread slave runaways, the seizure of patriot property, and later mounted black dragoons who were armed to the teeth with sabers at their sides, all did a lot to drive the white planter class toward rebellion against the crown. British policy in South Carolina essentially brought Dunmore's proclamation into the colony when they invaded the South Carolina-Georgia border in 1779. And this continued to affect colonial response in several ways. First, the colony's leaders felt the need to balance their recruiting efforts against the potential for slave insurrection if the white male population was off at war. And second, it meant that enslaved people were being treated like tactical pawns. And at least one historian has observed that African Americans were basically treated like de facto forms of currency in the Revolution. So just how many ran away in South Carolina? There's a debate over that. Historian David Ramsey estimated that perhaps 1/3 of South Carolina's enslaved population defected during the war. That would be a number somewhere north of 25,000 having run away to the British, if Ramsey's right. More recently, Simon Schama estimated that as many as 2/3 ran away. This is a number that I find to be a little bit high. Whatever the actual number was, it was considerable. And it was enough that Edward Rutledge and Thomas Lynch Jr. both called for the death penalty for enslaved people who joined with the British. But of course, who would have compensated Carolinians for lost investments? This was too great a cost for Rutledge and Lynch to enact the penalty. In the field, Thomas Sumter promised to pay his soldiers in part with a slave after they'd served with him for 10 months. Likely these would have been slaves recovered from the British or from seized Loyalist property. The policy became known as Sumter's Law. Meanwhile, John Laurens tried twice, unsuccessfully, to convince the Jacksonboro Assembly to allow him to raise a regiment of enslaved soldiers. His second attempt gained a little traction in the 1782 meeting of the Assembly. This came as British forces were increasing their efforts to wage war by liberating those who were enslaved by patriots. And Laurens' appeal also came on the heels of the formation of the Black Dragoons. Laurens' plan was overwhelmingly defeated, But the Assembly did vote at that meeting to sanction Sumter's law. And in fact, they expanded it, using confiscated enslaved people as currency and promising new recruits that they would receive one enslaved person per year for 3 years. What about African Americans amid the Patriot cause? We know there were at least some enslaved African Americans who served as soldiers, at least unofficially, such as those serving with Francis Marion. There were also a significant number of free persons of color serving in the Continental Army. Their presence was approved by George Washington early in the war. I recently saw a study by the late John Marker and Patricia Hinton, who identified nearly 85 free persons of color from South Carolina who served in the American military. And I actually suspect that number was probably higher. It should also be noted here that this number would have included not just free people of color with African ancestry, but also those with indigenous heritage. Of course, many others, free and enslaved, served as labor. Cooks, launderers, wagon drivers. One of these is memorialized as Oscar Marion, seen here, who reportedly served in Francis Marion's camp. There were an identifiable few who were rewarded with their freedom in exchange for their service. For various reasons, some of them philosophical, there was a momentary uptick in the number of slave emancipations during the Revolutionary era. And I'm going to come back to that in a moment. In the middle of the conflict, African Americans had terribly difficult choices to navigate. There were no guarantees that any particular decision or any side that they might choose would result in freedom or lasting security. I think the number that ran away or those who avoided the opportunity to run away to the British are not great indicators about their loyalty or their leanings. Running away to the British was a gamble. It may not have been a wise means for escape. Some enslaved people simply could not leave behind their families who may not be able to make an easy getaway. And as we have seen, some of those who did choose the British were sometimes left behind or recaptured anyway. We have examples of enslaved people who gambled on supporting the Patriot cause and some who were granted freedom for it. Moses Irvin, for example, was born enslaved and freed for his service. Irvin then benefited from that service long after the war. He was one of an important number of free people of color who, like William Davis that we met earlier, used their conduct in the Revolution to access greater degrees of freedom later in life. One of Irvin's petitions to the General Assembly is pictured here. Irvin reported in his petitions that he'd been captured by the British during the war near Nelson's Ferry on the Santee River, but that he escaped and went back to his master and was later hired out to Francis Marion during the war. And he reported that he was later freed for his, quote, faithful service. Now, in 1829, Irvin sent a petition to the legislature asking that he be allowed to free his own family. He owned them, but now he needed permission to set them free. The request was promptly denied. He applied again in 1836, and that's what you see here. This time he detailed, in this petition, he detailed his faithful service to the Revolution. And the legislature agreed to grant his request, and they did so with expressed recognition for his service in the Revolution. Now, Irvin's petition tells a subtle story. When he was captured, he could have gotten his freedom simply by staying with the British and capitalizing on Dunmore's proclamation, but for some reason he didn't. And it simultaneously demonstrates that, one, freedom for people of color was far from absolute after the Revolution, and I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. And two, that long after the war, some persons of color were able to trade on their service, to bolster their degrees of freedom, and overcome their often limited legal statuses in the Old South. But why did Irvin need the legislature's approval to free his family? I titled this lecture Freedom Deferred because it's important to reflect on and remember free and enslaved people of color's experiences and contributions during the Revolutionary era. But we also have to remember the next chapters of the story. So this title invokes civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph's observation that the American Revolution was perhaps an unfinished one. This was surely true for enslaved and free people of color as they came out of the war in South Carolina. As I mentioned a moment ago, there was a little wave of manumissions during the American Revolution. Manumission was the legal process whereby an enslaver could free or emancipate an enslaved person. And this could be done in a number of ways. During the Revolution, some enslavers were somewhat motivated by Enlightenment era philosophy and ideas like natural rights. A statistical analysis of manumissions in South Carolina during the 18th century, which was undertaken by historian Robert Olwell, found that indeed more than half, around 53% of all the manumissions he sampled during the 18th century took place during the years between 1775 and 1785. So let me rephrase that a little bit. A statistical analysis of all the a sample of manumissions from the 1700s found that about 53% of them happened in the 10-year period between 1775 and 1785. In an article that I published for the Carolog a few years ago, I highlighted the language used by one emancipator, Thomas Wadsworth, who in 1799 wrote that he was freeing people he'd enslaved because he'd been, quote, induced by notions of humanity. I don't think it's fair to say that the Revolutionary era held a real chance for widespread abolition. We can see that evidenced in American reaction to Dunmore's proclamation and in the South Carolina Assembly's refusal to allow John Laurens to arm enslaved people for the Patriot cause. Still, I think it might be fair to say that there was a brief moment, perhaps a dim glimmer of hope, but this glimmer was extinguished almost as soon as the revolution was over. So what changed? A lot changed. So let's talk about the things that changed for them coming out of the revolution and why this was deferred freedom. When Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin in 1794, it meant that short staple upland cotton could be a profitable cash crop in the inland South. So that one invention drove up the price of and demand for land and enslaved people in the South, and it absolutely recharged commitment to slave-based agriculture. Coming along beside the cotton boom were both the Haitian Revolution and a new talking point for defending slavery. Haiti gave whites more reason to fear that a class of free people of color would inspire slave rebellion. And of course, this was an anxiety that grew after the Denmark-Vesey conspiracy in 1822. And while cotton led to slavery's expansion in the inland South, and as the Haitian Revolution was transpiring, slavery's defenders in the United States were honing a new defense for their institution, what's called paternalism. Paternalism was an ideology that defended slavery by arguing in part that slavery was a positive good. And it rested on clearly flawed and frankly racist beliefs that enslavers were something like parents looking over children who were incapable of caring for themselves. All three of these circumstances resulted in state laws that closed the doors for enslaved people to become free, and in laws that denied citizenship for the small number of free people of color who were living here already. By 1800, the South Carolina legislature ruled that all manumissions had to be approved by a local jury of freeholders. And in 1820, the legislature tightened down even more, this time ruling that all manumissions could only go forward with approval from both houses of the state legislature, approval which they very, very rarely gave. And this was the precise reason why Irvin, that we met a few moments ago, had to ask for the legislature to approve his ability to free his wife and children. As I see it, the American Revolution represented a moment of delicate hope for African Americans. British strategy brought some opportunities for a freedom that ultimately proved far from perfect in the empire. And likewise, a brief moment of planter class altruism, inspired by the Enlightenment, had faded by 1800. And the moment of Revolutionary era emancipations had passed. While there was more work to be done for freedom, I'd like to close on a slightly more upbeat note. It's clear that African Americans made important contributions to our nation's founding. So let me leave you with this. Historians and students of the Revolution are now uncovering more and more stories from African Americans and indigenous patriots like Lafayette, like Irvin, and like Davis. And we are increasingly recognizing what they gave to our country's founding, the difficult choices and sacrifices they made while doing so, and the importance of their legacy going forward as we remember them and the fuller history of the Revolution. I want to take just a moment to give all of you my email address one more time in case you want to reach out to me. We're going to have time for questions, but my email address is dangerfd@email.sc.edu. So if you think of a question after we are finished tonight, don't hesitate to email me. I'm glad to correspond. I look forward to answering some questions, and I appreciate everyone's interest in this topic. And I want to thank you again for logging in tonight. So I'm going to go back to unsharing my screen, and hopefully we can chat a little bit.
Okay, as I said before, if you'll type your questions in the chat box, we can have some time to ask Dr. Dangerfield about his talk, which was very enlightening. I learned a lot of things I didn't know. So let's see. Elise asked, she was curious why you used the word defectors to describe those who fought for the British. They were not citizens, they had no rights. Also, did both the Patriots and the British promise to end slavery if they won the war?
So that's a fair question. I use defect, and I could probably use another word, but I use defect because the policy was only geared toward enslaved people who were owned by Patriot enslavers. So it was essentially run away from your Patriot master and join the British, and that's where I get the word defection. It did not apply to those who were enslaved by loyalists. As far as promising to end slavery after they won the war, I don't know about the British. They're not there yet. I mean, it takes them another quarter century to end slavery, at least in the slave trade, and then longer than that to end slavery in the British Empire. And no, the Patriots don't make that promise, at least not in the South. There are some states like Massachusetts, for example, when they write a new state constitution amid the Revolution, they get rid of slavery and create equal rights. But the Southern slave states aren't doing that. It's a good question.
Okay. Matt asked, can you address the subject of slave revolts during the unsettled revolutionary period? How did white Carolinians who were outnumbered by an enslaved avert a major rebellion during the American Revolution?
Matt, that's a good question. So this is a problem in the early 1780s when the British come bring Dunmore's proclamation with them. And I think really let's rewind a little bit, right? So we had the Second Cherokee War in 1776. I know these aren't enslaved people, but this is a population that the British turn against the colonists, particularly in the backcountry, and actually stoke a lot of resentment toward the British as a result of that. The same sort of effect is in play in the southern portion of the colony, where when Dunmore's proclamation arrives, you have this population of enslaved people who know they can be freed if they can just make it to British lines. They're doing so. The British were arming them. And I don't know that they averted a major slave rebellion. I mean, I think that this could be packaged as a widespread slave insurrection if David Ramsey's to be believed, and 25,000 ran away, joined with the British, helped the British war effort, undermined the American war effort. I think that could be considered a major slave rebellion, if not slave revolution, although it obviously failed as far as the colony and later state were concerned. But even after Yorktown, the British are able to outfit formerly enslaved people to fight against Patriot forces in South Carolina. I showed you the example of Oscar Marion, who, there's debate as to whether or not this was an actual person or a composite, but someone enslaved reportedly to Francis Marion, who was loyal in his camp. But we know that Francis Marion had people that he enslaved who ran away to the British and actually fought against him as mounted dragoons at the Battle of Wadoo Creek. So I don't know. It's a rambling answer to, I don't know that they averted a major slave rebellion. I would say that they were able to overcome a successful slave rebellion by defeating the British.
Mhm.
I'd have to think more about that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. Question about your email, which we typed up for them. And Sarah asked, can you suggest some Revolutionary War diaries that express the natural rights sentiment?
Goodness, diaries. I would have to think about that. I'm familiar with this through Orwell's writing and really through Wadsworth. I'd point you to the article I wrote in the Carolog a few years ago about Wadsworth and Turpin. They come along about 20 years after the revolution is over, 15 years or so. But these were men who enslaved they were merchants from Charleston. They enslaved dozens of people across the upstate and some in the Lowcountry as well. And Wadsworth in 1799 set free about 24 across Abbeville, Newberry, and Lawrence counties. He provided them with something like 50 acres of land, farm tools, and livestock so that they could support themselves. Obviously, this came 1 year before the legislature really started to crack down on enslavers' abilities to free enslaved people. But he said that he was doing it out of notions of humanity. And he left these free people now in the care of the Bush River Quakers, who the Quakers were abolitionists in the upstate. As a matter of fact, a lot of them fled the upstate over the issue of slavery. But he's an abolitionist in South Carolina in the 1790s. His business partner, William Turpin, leaves South Carolina and goes north, goes up to New York, and he dies in something like 1835. And he leaves a will that he ordered in the will that money be set aside to print up copies of his will and that it be distributed to newspapers and repositories across the country. So it's readily available online. He left money naming the people that his business partner set free 3.5 decades before, mentions them by name individually, leaving them money. But he also leaves money to prominent abolitionists. He leaves money to people that he himself had freed earlier in life, out beyond those freed by Wadsworth. And I've tried to find manuscript collections, diaries, things like that from this gentleman, because the two of them are just remarkably rare. And what I did find was letters that he wrote to John Adams, for example, saying, I'm an abolitionist. We need to help. Nobody knows the horrors of slavery better than me, because I was an enslaver and I had a change of heart. These are rare. These folks are rare. One of the phenomenon that Olwell points out in his statistical analysis is that, and I mentioned that manumission could take a variety of forms. One was self-purchase, where an enslaver would allow an enslaved person to purchase themselves. And Olwell found that even though some of these folks between 1775 and 1785 seemed moved by the revolution and natural rights, they're still demanding fair compensation, if you will, market price. I hate putting it that way, but they're not letting these folks off the hook when they allow for self-purchase. I can point you to a couple of secondary sources. One is not in South Carolina, but Virginia, a book called Israel on the Appomattox by Melvin Ely. I think gets at another one of these folks that has this change of heart during the Revolutionary era and makes arrangements to set free enslaved people that they had enslaved. And then I recommend Woody Holden's Liberty is Sweet for this topic as well.
Yes, both good sources. I think you might have answered this, but and the question is, were all the men who joined the Patriots freed after the war? Was it hit or miss?
It's very much hit or miss. That it seems to be very much hit or miss. We don't have, we're just now starting to compile who those free people, who those formerly enslaved and now free people were, who fought with the Patriot side. Some of these emancipations take place later in life through a will or through an act of emancipation, even after the legislature clamped down on it. So it's hard to tie them directly.
Okay. Jeff asked, were there major differences in the Revolutionary period experience of slavery between the upstate and the lower state of South Carolina?
Yeah, that point I made about the expansion of cotton is really important in South Carolina history. We talk about tensions between the Lowcountry and the Upcountry in the colonial era. The Lowcountry planters who really ruled over the political aspect and economic, obviously, aspects of the colony and then the state in its earliest days, the Lowcountry elite sort of looked sideways at the Upcountry because religion is largely different form of Christianity. They're not heavily invested in slavery in the Upcountry. The land values aren't very high. The highest land value in South Carolina in this era is places where you can grow rice. You can't grow a lot of rice in the Upcountry, not reliably anyway. So they really are not invested in slavery. So the Lowcountry elite worry about whether or not they can trust the Upcountry to support their political agenda, and the security of their economic positions as it was tied to slavery. This changes with the cotton gin. The type of cotton that will grow well in the Upcountry is short staple. Staple refers to the fiber length. It grows well in the inland South, but it is incredibly difficult to remove the seeds from the cotton bolls. So when Eli Whitney's machine allows you to very quickly and efficiently remove the seeds from the cotton bolls, now all of a sudden you have a profitable plantation crop in the inland South. Land prices rise because you can make money growing cotton, and slavery just explodes in the Upcountry. The price of slaves increases because demand goes up. And, this is why Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi are so quickly ushered into statehood shortly after 1800. It's a direct result of the expansion of cotton and slave-based agriculture.
Okay, Anne says the attempt at freedom after the revolution for a short period seems analogous to the short period of Reconstruction after the Civil War that then reverted to the Jim Crow era. She wanted to know your thoughts on that.
That's interesting. I think that there's not as much widespread hope for Black freedom after the revolution as there is obviously after Reconstruction, or after the Civil War and going into Reconstruction. But this moment of hope that's just dashed is a fair comparison to be made there. It's very interesting.
Yeah, it is. And we have one more that's Eleanor wants to know the names of the two gentlemen from Charleston that you were talking about. She missed them.
Thomas Wadsworth, Wadsworth, and William Turpin, Turpin.
Okay. Any more questions? Well, I think that's it. We certainly appreciate this presentation, Dr. Dangerfield.
I enjoy it.
And thank you to everyone who's in attendance. We have some very exciting events in Greenville next week featuring prominent author Rick Atkinson and one of my favorite historians, Jim Cobb. And there's still time to register for those, so go to our website to check them out. And if you're not already, I do hope you become a member of the South Carolina Historical Society. Take care and good night. Good night, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.